Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kinder, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. And if you want to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today, we are doing chapter 6 of Stepping Wild. Tibs sensed something ahead of them, but couldn't be certain what it was. Over a decade of pushing his sense, it had seemingly reached a limit at a distance equivalent to walking for the span of 4 fingers worth of the sun moving. An effect of sensing so far was that he could barely make out what he sensed within any of that distance. Even an adventurer next to him became nothing more than a fuzzy mass of essence he couldn't tell from another mass. He had learned to recognize signs within that fuzziness that warned of groups of people, bandits, when he was in the wilderness, which was the only place sensing this far served any purpose. It would be a barely detectable mass of life essence due to the number of people, with points of fire and metal. The closer he got, the more detail he made out. As he pulled sense in. But it wasn't until he was a finger's width worth distance that he could tell anything of use. He'd asked a scholar about it in relation to adventurers and how they sensed their element. He'd used Bard's song as the excuse for his questions, since they were constantly referring to the adventurers sensing something in the distance, usually in how the hero of the song found the villain. He'd had to listen to them droning on about essence not being what people thought it was, that a skilled adventurer could do whatever they wanted with their essence, that it was, after all, the basics of magic. How it was possible for them to sense what couldn't be perceived, that with training they could know things others could never do, never could. Of course, when Tibbs asked how, wait, why is that capitalized? When Tibbs asked, it's the how that should be capitalized. How they could do that, none of them had answers. It was simply magic. By what Tibbs sensed, there was trouble ahead of them. Fernan, he called to the guard looking after the wagons behind his. I need to have a talk with Rigel. Look over mine. He hurried his horse to the front of the caravan. He slowed it and settled next to the wagon. Sir, it's Rigel, the man sitting on the bench replied. One day you will call me by my name, Tyborg. Yes, sir, Rigel sighed. Tyborg had too much respect for the people in authority to ever address them by name. Graydon had resorted to threat of a knife in the gut before Tyborg had reluctantly begun addressing him as Gray. Rigel was too nice to pull off the kind of threat his man could. Let me guess. Is it slowing down to avoid a coming herd this time, or should we speed up? Like people, Animal barely registered to his sense. Their life essence was too thin, that was, unless there were a lot of them. A herd or pack with them. He also didn't need to send them or packs worth of them. Which I need to address because I've already established that he scares predators away. So, there was that was unless there was a lot of them, a herd or packs worth of them, which made scaring them with an etching risky. He had no way to predict how a herd would react. He also didn't need to sense them from so far to be able to advise on what they should do. It had come up twice over the last 2 months of travel. He had explained it he had a feeling. He couldn't claim to know how animals traveled without coming up with a believable explanation for how he knew, and while he was certain there were books about that too, he'd yet to be bored enough of his other research to look into that. Having a feeling was an expression nearly everyone used in their lives. I don't think so. I just thought it might be good for me to scout ahead. Rigel studied Tibs, looked at his eyes as he did each time Tibs had advised him, then shook his head and chuckled. The way the gut of yours tends to be right, I think you're touched. I'm not. Being touched by an element was what people called those who weren't adventurers, but still did things that seemed impossible. The reasoning being that without the help of the elements, they wouldn't have been able to. In Tibbs's experience, skill accounted for most of the cases he'd witnessed, and randomness for the others. And only extremely rarely had a person had the faint tint to their essence that spoke of a connection to an element. What he never understood was the reflex to check the eyes. It was impossible to miss with the adventurers and impossible to see with anyone else. Even those with the faint connection didn't show the element's color in their eyes. Then it's going to be trouble, isn't it? Thinks we're better served if I go check and I'm wrong than not, and we're surprised by bandits. Rigel looked into the distance ahead of them. Bandits, huh? What else would it be out here? More likely to be a dungeon-made monsters than bandit. There's a dungeon in the area? Tibbs looked around. There wasn't one. If there was, there would be a town near already. The guild taking possession of it, and there was no mountain. Rigel laughed. This would be a city road if there was, not some place weeks away from even a village. Bandits make more sense then. Go, the caravan master motioned to Tibbs. I'll let Gray know we might encounter trouble. He set his horse to a canter until he couldn't make out the wagon, then pushed it to a gallop. He applied etching of purity to the animal to deal with the damage pushing it without rest caused. As he pulled in his scents, getting closer, he gained more definition and confirmed what he suspected. Water held up, it would be in barrel. Metal containing fire. Brazier moving life metal containing fire. Brazier. Moving life essence with metal against them, people, and the weapons they carried. 20 of them. By the weapons being carried. There might be more. In the wild, bandits often resorted to clubs, which he couldn't sense. The camp was far from the road, and he didn't sense anyone close to it, so they weren't aware of the caravan yet. There would be sentries. There could be. No, There could be sentries, but their essence was too thin for him to sense. Would be too thin, too faint for him to sense lone people unless he pulled his focus in tighter. Either that, got closer and didn't sense anyone. Not every bandit camp Tibbs had encountered over the years used sentry. Many counted on the sounds of caravans made. He didn't bother with hiding the sounds of his horse. They were too far in the forest to hear a lone traveler, and he could deal with sentries if they were present. By the time Tibbs was close, he'd had to dispatch 2 of them. He couldn't give them the luxury of letting them leave. They'd run to the camp, and them knowing Tibbs was on his way would just complicate matters. He walked the horse among the trees on the opposite side of the bandit camp, tied it to one, and removed armor and clothes. He didn't need them for this. Claiming he'd found nothing, when returning with his armor cut and pierced, raised too many questions. He'd learned that through experience. Whispers had gone beyond him being touched and into him being a dungeon-made creature. He'd vanished into the forest and continued alone to the next city. He hadn't gone into battle against Bandit when he was alone, wearing his armor since. Wearing a worn shirt and bracers and pants, but no boots, Tibbs trekked through the trees until he oh, I don't need that. Trekked until he reached the camp. Couldn't understand the language as he got close enough to hear them, but the tone of discontent came through clearly. It was months between caravans, and they would be tired of waiting. He walked between tents at the periphery and among the bandits. Greetings! The reaction was instantaneous. Two and two people jumped to their feet, sword and clubs in hand. He chuckled at himself at how he'd fallen back into his old numbers. He rarely did that anymore, and usually when things didn't go his way. They were dressed in clothing more worn than his. They were dirty and too thin. Some, he sensed, were on the last of their essence. Someone asked a question he didn't understand. Let's try this again, he said in Urinian this time. It wasn't common within this kingdom, being the main one. 2 kingdoms over, the dear wise, but there had been a war a century back that had brought many of them here. Can you understand me? I'd rather not start this without at least giving you the option to leave, the option of leaving. Leave? The woman replied in a mocking tone. He smiled. Good, you understand. As someone who knows you might not be doing this out of choice, I'm telling you to leave. The approaching caravan is under my protection. The fact hunger might be driving you to this won't hold me back, won't keep me from making sure their travels are undisturbed. She spoke in hurried tones, and the other's excitement told him she wasn't telling them to make plans to leave. The man who grinned at Tibbs had blackened and crooked teeth. Even without this fight, he had no more than a day's worth of essence in him. He said something in nasty tone without looking away. A rope'll take shirt for him, the woman said in a defiant tone. Pants go to who kill you. Have it your way. He ran at them, and only 3 weren't surprised at the rush or that he was unarmed. He kept the etching in his mind as he jumped at the larger man, raising his arm as if he was armed. He channeled water, and he released it. The expression went from smug to terrified as the ice formed over Tibbs, an armor that glinted in the sunlight. The sword that formed in his hand was a thing with vicious spikes jutting from a sharp edge. The man's sword shattered from the impact and was cut through as Tibbs landed before him. The screams as Tibbs ripped it out of the body were as much terror as rage. A few ran. He envisioned the etching and released it with the sweeping of his sword. Thin blades flew at their back. They fell, but only one's essence leaked quickly. The impact staggered Tibbs forward and cracked his armor. He reformed the etching as he straightened and turned to face the muscular woman. She stepped back in surprise. His eyes told her what she hadn't understood the appearing armor meant. She steadied herself and with a scream brought the large warhammer down on him. He channeled earth and coated his arm with it, stretching it down the side of his body and to his feet. He caught the head in a hand, and the force of the impact sent down along the earth instead of through his bones. He softened the metal, and his fingers sunk in. She nearly pulled him off his feet as she yanked it back, but he took hold of the essence and held it in place. She pulled harder. He pulled, and she staggered into his sword. He casually flipped the warhammer into the air as he stepped back, caught the shaft and swung it into her side, adding his will to the blow. There was no essence left in her by the time she crashed through the shoddy tent. The arrow bounced off the side of his helmet, and he turned. He hadn't expected them to have an archer. The woman was already releasing another, and Tibbs sent it careening with a wave of the hand and a burst of air. He sent essence at, at the fire in the brazier next to her, and she was engulfed in the explosion. He blocked a sword, then turned to face the man. He parried the following attack and stepped out of the way of the sweeps. He thrust. The thrust made it past Tibbs's parry through the armor. The man smirked and said something. Tibbs punched him away. He pulled the sword out and with a smirk of his own let the essence that made it go. He dropped the leather and wood that had been the pommel to the ground. The man cursed. Tibbs turned to face the two wielding clubs running at them. Another etching as he raised his arm, and a shield of clear eyes blocked them. He grinned at their stunned expression, then he had a sword in hand and cut their stomach open with it. He made two ice blades and threw them at the two fleeing. One missed entirely. The next one he directed with his will, and the woman fell too. Why was throwing so abyss hard? He blocked the woman's sword and moved to the shield. And moved the shield's ice over it before she pulled it away. He wrenched it out of her hand and cut her down. He looked for his next opponent, but all that was left of the bandits were the whimpering of those dying. He ended them with a cut across the throat. He let the etching that made his armor, shield, and weapon go and looked at the carnage he'd wrought. He felt no guilt. He'd given them the option to leave. They'd chosen to fight. Now, to remove the evidence. He crouched and placed a hand on the ground. It parted under each of the bodies, swallowing them, then closed. He couldn't regrow the patches of grass, but he moved others to mask the shape of the holes. The fire he extinguished, then pulled even the residual heat from the coals and ashes. With air he scattered them and the tents. If Graydon sent someone to check, they'd think it had been at least days since the bandit had given up and left. He returned to his horse, cleaned the fight off him, and dressed. Then rode back. So, you came back. Graydon rode next to Rigel's wagon. Figured you'd turned thief and stole my horse to ride to the rest of the way on your own. Come now, hon. The caravan master chided him. Tyborg wouldn't do that. I told you, you went scouting. Do we need to get ready for an attack? Tib shook his head. All I found was an old camp. They must have given up waiting. Or moved to a better location, Graydon countered. If that's the case, I'm sure Tyborgs will feel the need to scout again ahead. To start ahead again. Rydell smiled. Isn't that right? Tibbs realized that always being somewhat correct each time he came to the man could be giving the caravan leader the wrong impression, or the correct one, which Tibbs didn't want him to get. It might be best if the caravan got caught, to let the caravan be caught in the next herd that crossed their path. And that concludes Chapter 6 of Stepping Wild. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter will be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read this story, it is available on Ream Story. No. Well, yes, but if you want to read it for free, it's on Royal Road. I need to get used to this. And if you want to support me and read ahead of Royal Road by about a dozen chapter, that is on Ream Story. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. Links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.